perhaps if I ask you about the mind, how would you describe the mind to me? What is the mind?
It is something that is here, that can regulate stress and emotion and the experience of what's happening around us, or help us perceive or judge. It's not us, but it is that it helps us make decisions. Oh, I'm not being very coherent, but
Yeah, no, that's really good. So it's something around us, generally sort of associated with our head, maybe the brain, and it helps us to perceive the world we live in. It helps us to make sense, doesn't it, of what we perceive, of what we experience. So through the experience, through the judgment, and so is it a part of the body? Would you say it's part of the body? No?
I want to detach from it sometimes.
In some ways it is, well, it's not really part of the body, but it's also exists within the body in a way, so connected to the body. But yeah, the mind is a tricky one to define, but from my awareness, it's about the part of us that is consciousness, that our ability to have awareness and consciousness, to be consciously experiencing the world.
So the mind allows us to consciously experience the world. The mind. So is mind consciousness?
Pretty much. And awareness and consciousness.
So mind is awareness and consciousness. Is there, though, maybe an awareness or a consciousness that is beyond the mind?
Definitely.
I feel like the mind is like the governor of our thoughts.
Yeah. So good. That's a good observation. The mind is the governor of the thoughts. So where do the thoughts come from?
To your emotions. So like if you feel an emotion, the thought is a product of that emotion, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely a relationship, isn't there, between emotions and thoughts?
That all everything comes from thought. Like he said that the emotion, the originator is the thought, and then everything else follows from that. That was his theory.
Whose theory? Sorry.
Randa.
Who? Sorry.
Randa.
Ram Dass.
Yeah.
Yes.
He said everything starts with rather than so all emotions just come from the thought. That's what he said.
So could we postulate that maybe the mind incorporates all of that? That the mind actually generates the thoughts? Then the mind actually allows us to make sense of the thoughts, and it also allows us to experience or to make sense of our experience, or to and the experience? Well, I think we could, and there's different ways that we can look at the mind. And so I think first of all, maybe just looking at it from a psychological point of view, so from the perspective of psychology. If I share my screen now, and if you look at this figure here, can you all see this figure? This is, from a psychological point of view, the different compartments, you could say, of the mind. So we have the sensory mind, so the different senses that experience the world, our smell, our taste, our touch, our sight, our hearing. That's, the sense organs are the way that we can take in the experience of what we connect with in the manifest world through the sense organs. And the sense organs feed the information into what we might call the conscious mind. So the sense organs is, in a way, a part of the sensory aspect of the mind. And then at another level we have the discriminating mind, which is the thinking and the emotions, and then the narrating part of that as well. The part that creates the story from what we've experienced, what we've seen. So this is in psychology called the mind system, rather than the mind itself. It's the way that the mind works. So the conscious and the unconscious being the two main parts. And the unconscious is kind of the behind the scene activities, where the behind the scene activities happen. So it's all that processing, it's all that storage of what we experience, of what we see, of what we learn, what we know. We keep it in the unconscious mind. So it's always there to be able to be brought up to. So the conscious mind is the mind that we're in the moment using to think, to operate in the moment, but it's fed through the unconscious mind, which kind of not always aware of the unconscious aspect, I guess. But it's that thing of we learn so like we learn how to navigate from the yoga studio to your house. The directions that you don't consciously have to think about it. Your unconscious mind has learnt that, has stored that, so you can drive, and you could be using your conscious mind to do something completely different. To be talking to someone on the phone while you're driving, which we don't advise that, but that's possible. You can be talking and having a good old chat, but subconsciously you're going all the way home without even thinking. You haven't even noticed the path you've taken because of the unconscious storage that's there. So in this model, they see the conscious mind kind of like as a screen. So that middle bit is like the screen, and then our sensory experiences moments of consciousness that are projected onto the screen. So the consciousness is either a visual experience or an auditory experience or a somatic experience and so on. And now I'm just going into this book on the mind which says our experience of these moments of consciousness is passive, yet recall from the moments of consciousness model that every moment also has an active component, intention. The intention in a moment of consciousness may be subliminal, remaining in the background, or may itself become an object of attention. These conscious intentions can be precursors to mental, verbal, or physical actions. For example, say that a moment of somatosensory consciousness arises. That's somatic, when you're feeling, touching something. Let's say with an unpleasant skin sensation as its object. So unpleasant skin sensations happening. So the accompanying intention might be a spontaneous urge to scratch an itch. So you're getting an itch, you're getting an uncomfortable sensation. And so your intention is then the urge to scratch that itch. Or, like from a visual perspective, let's say, if there's an object that's interesting that arises in your field of vision, there becomes the intention to stay focused on it. So consciously we experience this as interest and continued attention to something that causes your attention, like a beautiful flower. So when we're using the sense of sight, we're taking in all sorts of things in each moment, but we're not necessarily consciously, from that intentional consciousness, registering everything that we're seeing in our field of vision. You know, right now I'm looking at you guys on the screen, but in my field of vision there's also the cabinet behind you, the books on the ground, the lamp up there. You know, I'm not really, because I'm talking about it, I'm registering it, but otherwise it's there, but it's not registering. I'm focused on you guys. So objects such as memories and ideas perceived via the mind sense also have intentions associated with them. Say a particular memory from your childhood arises, that moment of consciousness arrives with an intention to pursue a sequence of thoughts associated with the memory. If the intention is strong enough, that's exactly what happens. Consciously, you will experience yourself starting to reminisce about your childhood. So we often feel like we're engaging in these long trains of thought intentionally, yet, as you know from your practice, they can be spontaneous and impulsive as well. The intention connected with a mental object such as a memory can drag attention through a long sequence of impulsive thoughts. Once again, all moments of consciousness have intentions associated with them, intentions that we may experience consciously as an impulse towards some mental, verbal, or physical action. Now, the unconscious part of the mind system is divided into the sensory and the discriminating mind. So they can be both conscious and unconscious. But from an unconscious point of view, the sensory mind processes information from the 5 physical senses. It generates moments of sights, sound, smell, and so forth. And in contrast, the discriminating mind, the greater part of which is called the thinking or emotional mind, produces moments of consciousness with mental objects such as thoughts and emotions. It's the part of the mind where reasoning and analysis occur. The sensory and discriminating minds are each composed of many individual subminds that function simultaneously and autonomously. like major divisions within a corporation, each with many departments serving specific purposes. Each submind independently performs its own specific task in the service of the mind system as a whole. So that's where it comes into point of what we were kind of asking ourselves before, is the mind this, is it that, is that part of the mind? So yeah, the mind is kind of like it's got all these little subsections of both experiencing, of storing, and of operating, narrating, making sense of, telling the story. So our sensory mind is concerned with information coming from the outside through our physical senses. And there's those 5 sub-minds within the sensory mind. And they each exclusively work within their own sort of subspace. The visual through the eyes experiences what we see. And that's that part of the sensory mind there, the sight aspect, and so on. Each 5 has its own specific cognitive domain with its own function. And we're seeing how there are these different kind of subsections of the mind. At the moment we're talking about the sensory mind being the aspect of the mind that experiences our phenomenal world through our sense organs. So through our eyes, our nose for smell, tongue for taste, and so on. So the job of each of these subminds is to process and interpret this data as it comes in. So first of all, the subminds create sense percepts from that raw information, mental representations of the actual stimulus received by the sense organ. So the sense organ, we smell a particular smell through the organ of the nose as our sense organ, and then that part of the mind that it's called the olfactory meaning the part of the smell that creates a perception. It perceives that experience of the smell. And we perceive things such as something that's warm through touch, something that's blue through the sight, the colour, or a chirp of a bird, for example, through our hearing. And these perceptions then reach our consciousness in the sense of the conscious mind, or the unconscious mind to be stored there. In the sense of our individual consciousness. So they're kind of recognized, they're categorized, analyzed, and evaluated in terms of their immediate importance. So, for example, if you hear an external sound that the auditory mind picks up, the auditory mind takes that raw information, processes it, converts it into a very raw kind of mental representation of that sound. That sense percept may take the form of, let's say, a loud, sharp noise. The next step is for the auditory mind to recognize the sense percept, give it a more descriptive but very basic label like a hand clap, and then categorize and evaluate it as something unexpected but not threatening. So remember, this all happens in the unconscious before you have the conscious experience of hearing the sound of the hand clap. So finally, each submind can also store these sense percepts, adding them to a database or inventory that makes it easier to interpret new information in the future. So before the mind registers the hearing, there's all that storage going on. There's all that filing discriminating, registering within all these different aspects of the mind. So it's, it's instant, it's lightning fast, but there's kind of a lot going on for each sensory experience. So at the end of this process, the unconscious auditory mind projects the hand clap into your peripheral awareness. From there, it becomes the object of a moment of attention. Keep in mind that unlike in this example, most sounds, sights, smells, etc., processed by the sensory mind remained in a kind of awareness that happens entirely at an unconscious level. Think of what I was saying, all the things that we see on our periphery, all the things that we hear, but they're not important to us in the moment. They don't, they're not in our conscious awareness. They're in a sort of a peripheral awareness. That's the stuff that just goes into the unconscious part of the mind. The whirring of a fan, the sensation of sitting in a chair, the faint smell of carpet cleaner, all examples of things we might not be conscious of, but potentially could be. They don't become conscious because they're filtered out at the level of subconscious awareness. But along with these sense, so this is the idea of sense percept, perceiving through the senses. So the mind works at perceiving the experience that the sense presents us. So that's the sense percept aspect of the mind, what it does. But then there's also this idea that the submind can produce a hedonic feeling of either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So this is something that accompanies that moment of consciousness. For example, the somatosensory mind will evaluate a cool breeze on the skin as pleasant, but maybe a mosquito bite as unpleasant. By contrast, just the sensation of the breath moving in out of the nostrils is just neutral. It's neither pleasant or unpleasant. And another significant point is that they play an important role in automatic reactions. For example, if the auditory mind picks up a strange or unexpected sound, your head will immediately turn towards that sound. That's an inborn reflex, but there's many other automatic reactions that we learn through practice and repetition, like when a sprinter leaps off the starting block in response to the starter's gun. Whenever a reflex motor response is programmed to a particular stimulus, the sensory submind involved will automatically initiate the response. This means we'll never be conscious of an intention to perform a reflex action. It just happens. We only become aware of the action once it's already in motion. So as you can tell, these sensory subminds are all doing a lot of processing outside of our regular consciousness. The final products of these activity are sense percepts, so the perception of the sense, associated hedonic feelings of either pleasurable, unpleasurable, or neutral, and automatic responses that the body might take. When sense
really cool. Can I please just give a really cool little example of that?
Yeah, please.
This morning, I've got a basket on the bathroom, above the bathroom cabinet thing, and the whole basket actually fell off. It's got a couple of hairbrushes and a hairdryer in it, and it started falling, and I put my hands up to catch it before I was even almost aware that it was falling, and I just remember going, damn, you got good reflexes, talking to myself. But it was amazing, the subconscious mind processed that before my conscious mind was even aware that there was the thing falling. So yes, really cool example.
And yeah, your hands were there before you even thought about, I better bring my hands up to catch that. That was that automatic response that your sensory mind helped to kick in. Yeah.
Oh, sensory, yeah, that's amazing. That's just incredible. Like, yeah, we're processing and observing and filtering in like so much all the time, so much that we're not consciously aware of.
Mm.
It's amazing.
So these sense mind responses, or the percepts, the feelings, and whatnot, they're projected into our consciousness, and then that information then becomes available as input for the discriminating mind. So that's giving an overview of how the sensory mind works. And so once that has happened, and it's either been processed, stored, or acknowledged in whichever way, then it gives then the discriminating mind the opportunity to do its work. So the sensory mind don't project every sense percept they generate into consciousness, but those they do become available to the discriminating mind. It assimilates that information, further processing these sense percepts, and transforms them into more complex mental representations, in other words, into perceptions. So the discriminating mind begins to perceive. For example, the visual mind will project a collection of sense percepts into consciousness as, say, an image of a rapidly moving black and red thing, or an even more specific image, such as a black and red flying thing, maybe a black and red bird flying by. So the discriminating mind takes that and creates more elaborate representations of this simple concept by combining it with memories, previous sense percepts, and other stored information, and even things from our imagination. The image of a black and red bird thus becomes transformed into the specific conceptual object, the red-winged blackbird. The original sense percepts may have been accompanied by a hedonic feeling of pleasure at the gracefulness of the shape and the combination of black and red. The discriminating mind might then add its own emotional overtones, such as an experience of happiness at seeing and correctly identifying such a beautiful bird. The perceptions based on sense percepts are only one kind of mental object produced by the discriminating mind. It also generates a large variety of other, more purely conceptual representations, such as thoughts and ideas. Emotions such as joy, fear, and anger likewise come from the discriminating mind, which is why we call a major part of it the thinking, emotional mind. Finally, it can produce its own hedonic feelings of pleasure and displeasure. So here's an example of how the discriminating mind works. Let's say that earlier in the day someone called you pushy. After that thought registered in consciousness, it sank into the discriminating mind. Throughout the day, the discriminating mind further digested that information on an unconscious level, perhaps deciding that being called pushy was unpleasant. Later that night, the discriminating mind may project a memory of the incident back into consciousness along with a feeling of displeasure. When this displeasing memory becomes an object of consciousness, the discriminating mind can process it even more and project new thoughts or emotions about the incident into consciousness. Questions may arise such as, what does pushy mean? Should I feel ashamed or angry about being called pushy? Or maybe proud, since pushiness is a kind of assertiveness? Or is it really true? Or should I try to change? So these are examples intended to give you a sense of how the discriminating mind works. However, speaking of it as though it were only one thing is misleading. In reality, the discriminating mind consists of many separate subminds, just like the sensory mind. So each submind performs specialized activities and has its own particular function and purpose. This can be anything from performing arithmetic to caring for a baby, to deciding when a situation calls for you to get angry. Any or all of these subminds can be active at the same time, and although several may be working on the same task, they do so independently of each other. That will make a bit of sense. If we zoom in and look at these discriminating subminds in more detail, there's a continuous stream of information flowing into consciousness. Each submind only takes from consciousness the information relevant to its particular job and ignores the rest. After the selected information has been discriminated and recombined in various ways, the result may be projected back into consciousness. In our earlier example, one particular submind of the discriminating mind projected the final perception of a red-winged blackbird into consciousness. However, in the interim, following the early image of a black and red moving object, many other subminds may have projected information into consciousness that contributed to that final perception. As each submind acquires more and more information relevant to its purpose, it organizes that information into its own continuously evolving model of reality. When you are 8, you may have firmly believed in Santa Claus, but at some point you realize Santa doesn't exist. This potentially difficult insight forced specific subminds to revise their model of reality. Each submind also evaluates all new information and produces hedonic feelings of pleasure or displeasure in response. For example, the submind responsible for rational thought may feel great pleasure in systematically tearing apart the logical flaws in another person's theory. A different submind may produce feelings of displeasure when you run into your ex-spouse. These hedonic feelings in turn trigger craving in the form of desire or aversion. All of this becomes a source of intentions that produce mental, verbal, and physical actions in an attempt to satisfy desire and aversion. So the mind could have different agendas. We experience this as internal conflict over what to do in a given moment. One part of the mind...
Your screen froze, I think. If it did for anybody else, I'm not sure.
Yeah, it did. It froze.
Okay. So,
About 15 seconds.
okay, so I was probably up to the idea...
Oh, about the spouse. I think you're up to about running into an ex-spouse, and then it froze for me. But
okay, so yeah, so when you run into your ex-spouse or whatever sort of situation which could be, let's say, seen as unpleasurable, that's the hedonic feeling that the mind triggers. That feeling of displeasure becomes and then creates the source of the intention to produce either a mental, a verbal, or a physical action to satisfy the aversion. In that case of the ex-spouse, you want to avoid the ex-spouse, so you quickly turn the other way, or whatever reaction your mind's gonna encourage you to make. But yeah, often we experience this idea of an internal conflict, where one part of the mind wants to, let's say, meditate, but other parts would prefer to have a drink, read a book, nap, or engage in a sexual fantasy. These conflicting desires are evidence of different subminds functioning independently within the discriminating mind. Each of these subminds wants you to be happy, but each has a different idea of the best way to do that. When we consider the diverse influences these unconscious minds exert on our everyday actions, it's amazing we manage as well as we do. One of the reasons we usually function without too much trouble is because, in a manner of speaking, not all discriminating subminds are created equal. fact, they're arranged in a hierarchy. At the top are subminds in charge of things like personal values, self-image, and weighing in consequences. These tend to dominate other subminds, such as the erotic submind or the submind responsible for anger. So that's as far I want to go. As far as I want to go with looking at the mind from that psychological point of view. And that's mostly coming from another wonderful book called The Mind Illuminated, which is actually a book.
Yeah, the book that you just mentioned, the book that you just read, is that this one?
Yeah.
Or the other? Oh, which one? Okay.
And it's actually a book on meditation, where it focuses on integrating Buddhist wisdom with brain science for greater mindfulness.
Wow.
Wonderful.
Holy moly. And that's on the
Say again the name of the book, please.
The Mind Illuminated.
Kuladasa.
Yeah, Culadasa is the author.
Amazing. Thank you.
Now, when we when we look at the Yoga Sutras, of course, that becomes one of the main topics is the mind. So if you turn to your, you don't have to turn to it, but I'll read it. But on the in the Yoga Sutras, the second verse is explaining, what is yoga really all about. So the first verse is Atta Yoganusasanam, which is with prayers for divine blessings now begins an exposition of the sacred art of yoga. So the first verse is, and here we go, this is yoga. And then the second verse is Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. And so that verse there is kind of like a really key verse, something that you want to learn. You want to learn that verse. Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. So what does it mean? Yoga in the sense of the word meaning the union of the different elements of who we are. So the outermost layer to the innermost self. The skin, the muscles, the bones, the nerves, but then the mind, the intellect, the will, the consciousness, and the self. So it's the union of all those aspects is yoga. Chitta is consciousness. So chitta means consciousness, and from the yogic perspective, there's three factors of consciousness, which is the three aspects being manas, which is mind, buddhi, which is intellect, and ahamkara, which is ego. So chitta, or consciousness, from the yogic perspective, is the mind, the intellect, and the ego. So it's got the functions of cognition, conation, ovulation, and motion. Vritti is the state of mind, the fluctuations in the mind, the movement. Vritti is essentially the movement. And nirodha is the obstruction, the annihilation, or the cessation. So what that's meaning is basically yoga is the cessation of movement in the consciousness. Yoga is the cessation of movements in the consciousness. So it's the restraint of fluctuations in the consciousness. It's the art of studying the behavior of consciousness, which has three functions: cognition, conation or volition, and motion. Yoga shows ways of understanding the functioning of the mind and helps to quieten their movements, leading one towards the undisturbed state of silence, which dwells in the very seat of consciousness. Yoga is thus the art and science of mental discipline through which the mind becomes cultured and matured. So that's the explanation of that sutra from Iyengar's Light on the Yoga Sutras.
Like yoga is the cessation of the conscious mind, the movement of the conscious mind. Can you explain more?
Yes.
How yoga? I mean, is that yoga asana or yoga sutra or what exactly yoga here? That can help.
Good question. So that's kind of like the ultimate aim of yoga is through meditation practice, but through the 8 limbs. I mean, this is the first pada of the Yoga Sutras. The first pada is like, here is the aim. Here's what we're intending to do. And then the second pada is the 8 limbs of yoga. So it gives you the recipe. So, it's like, here's your cake. This is what we want. We want to be able to eat this wonderful, tasty cake. But to be able to eat this cake, we need to get the flour, the eggs, all the different materials to put it together so we can create the cake. So the 8 limbs of yoga is the recipe. But the outcome is ultimately the cessation of the fluctuations of the mind, in the sense of being able to create that deeper aspect of the union of yoga. Of yoga meaning the union of my inner self, my Atman, with the Brahman, with the universal consciousness. So this is where we start to talk about that difference in consciousness, individual consciousness and universal consciousness. And the universal consciousness is ultimately the aim of what we want to be able to immerse into, connect with. It's that ascension of going back to spirit. We've descended from spirit into a material body, into this physical body, which has as its kind of it's like the body's is the vehicle, and then we have some software that drives the body, and that's the mind that makes sense of the experiences that we're having. So it's a really useful tool to be able to experience this 3D world that we're living in temporarily. But ultimately, we are still imbued in our essence with this universal consciousness. So we've manifested into this physical form and we get very stuck in the mind aspect, in the identity with the mind, because the mind's always very, very busy doing what we just looked at. It's the perceiving through the senses everything that we experience, so sensory part of the mind, but then the discriminating mind, then being able to make sense of our experiences and judge them, analyze them, talk about them, fantasize about them, or create completely irrelevant thoughts that we get lost in. So a lot of it's very useful and necessary. Like the mind is a tool that we can't function in this world without. But ultimately, what yoga wants to do is to be able to bring a pause into that busyness of the mind, to open up that space, that spaciousness, that quiet space, which then will allow us to move beyond the mind and back into universal consciousness, back to the source, back to spirit. So that's why it's useful to try to understand how our minds operate. What is the mind and how it functions, and what are maybe our particular tendencies? What are the particular tendencies of our minds? And recognizing also from that point of view of all that's in duality is impermanent. So from that deeper perspective, it's unreal. It's the yogis call it Maya. It's an illusion. From the sense of the only reality, the only real thing, the only permanent thing is that universal, never undying consciousness, which we are a part of. We don't have to worry about losing anything, because we're always there, but we're just not recognizing it because we're getting very stuck in our individualistic bubble that's being created by our mind, which it needs to, because we need to be able to operate on an individualistic level in this world. But still, individuality is impermanent. Our thoughts come and go. Our body grows old and dies, it'll go. Everything passes.
Yeah, it just remind me about one interesting thing is, I know each one, if they face some situation, they will start to realize that they are not themselves, they are not just their own body, but they're connected to the universal consciousness. But if they are not experiencing any event, for them to start to realize that, if there's any, like, what do you think that can just help them open more for that concept that they are connected to something bigger?
Sorry, I missed. I didn't quite get the first part. Can you repeat that?
Yeah, I mean, like, for some people, they can experience that, and they can open for the concept that they are connected to the universal consciousness, just naturally.
Yep.
Naturally, yes. But for those who are not open yet, what is one thing that you may suggest them so that they can start to be open more for that?
Okay.
That's like the eternal question, isn't it?
I know, yeah. It's interesting things, because I think everyone, it's beneficial for everyone to know that, but those experience already know. So those who don't experience need to know. So how we can suggest them to experience that.
But don't they say that a normally great awakening, like people who aren't consciously aware or awake, you know, regarding what you're speaking about, it almost takes like a huge traumatic event to kind of trigger a need to heal and to live life differently and not be, you know, a slave to your emotions and your perceptions of the world and your conditioning. And
but isn't that too painful to go through that traumatic event just to realize that? So I just want to see if there's a way that they can avoid a bit of that painful thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Good. No, it's a good question, Anne, and that's true, both of you. I mean, often people, a trauma will bring them to that either whether it's a realization or just an inquiry. But I guess ultimately that's what it's about. It's about a desire to inquire into the nature of who we are. Ultimately, I mean, you know, ask yourself that question: who are you? Who am I? Who am I really? You know, from where do I come from? Where am I going to go to when I die? I mean, that's the ultimate question, and that's where that desire to understand that will take you into that inquiry, and then you know then be open to look into these bigger questions. But I guess what you could suggest is something like, well, do you ever have just that deep inner sensation of happiness or just feeling calm and peaceful, you know, those feelings that just arise spontaneously? Do you ever feel peaceful or calm or happiness for no apparent reason? And you know, where's that coming from? And then what is the source of that happiness? And those moments, I mean, I like to often talk about those moments of wonder as those moments of non-duality. So those moments of wonder when you do see the red and black bird that flies overhead, in that moment of like, there it goes. You know, there's a moment of non-duality where for a moment your separation isn't there. It's not me and the black and red bird. It's just a moment of like wonder, delight when you experience something in the moment, before the cognitive mind comes in to analyze, categorize, and narrate the story. But in that moment of just that connection, you know, that deep connection is you know, you have those wow moments of just like, oh my God. and that's I think that's a nice reminder of the connection to non-duality, to the, you know, the eternal consciousness. I've seen the time, and I did want to go through a whole bunch of other stuff with you. We're running out of time. Timing is an illusion, though, so let's just stop time for a moment. How are you all doing for time? Can we go over time today, or anyone got to rush off?
I can go over a little bit. I do have to go somewhere, kind of. Yeah, I'm alright for another 15 minutes or so after 5 o'clock.
Okay, I'd like to just go through another little thing. I think it won't take more than 10-15 minutes just to read something else that a friend of mine's written, which really is kind of like a bit of a link between the yogic concept of mind and that psychological context. I feel it's kind of like a bit of a linking story. And then I've also got 2 really short videos, but I'll just send you the links for those and you can watch them yourselves. They're really short. They're only one's 11 minutes and the other's 7 minutes or something like that. So less than 20 minutes, so you can watch them another time. But let's have a quick read of this. Share screen. So this friend of mine, Eric, writes, the body, mind, intellect, he calls it the BMI, as one sort of organism. So he says, whatever is outwardly perceived, felt, or experienced is made possible by sentience. Whatever is inwardly conceivable is made possible by cognition. So you could say that sentience is the sensory mind, and then the cognition is the dissecting mind. What do we call it? The discriminating mind. Yeah. These two general faculties are housed in the body, mind, intellect organism, hereafter called the instruments of experiencing. Organism simply means something that is organized. Think of the BMI organism as an unimaginably complex instrument, vehicle or vessel that's fundamentally necessary in order to experience the phenomenon of human expression and all that entails. The organism in its entirety is comprised of matter, energy and light, various energetic expressions, layers of personality, states of mind, etc. The clear understanding of these and their functions is the aim of discernment. But why is this of any importance really? Because our whole experience of life is dictated by ignorance and error programmed into the way the BMI organism processes and interprets life's collective biodata. If there's a missing function or error, then the entire process is compromised. Through mastering the power of discernment, we can learn to harmonize with life, which leads to the highest possible potential. Understanding who and what we truly are begins with knowing clearly how we are limiting ourselves, thus clarifying who and what we are not. Typically, we feel that we are skin-encapsulated egos, but there is a marvelous sense of opening to our higher selves when we rediscover that who or what we truly are is far more magnificent than any such limited identification. So here's a wonderful idea of how that can be broken up. So this consciousness awareness, which is that which comes from that universal consciousness awareness, but it permeates through each and every one of us as an awareness. And then there is this memory and conditioning, which mostly feeds from the other direction, back into the consciousness or awareness, but somewhat could potentially also feed from the other way. And then we are divided into the BMI, the body, the mind, and the intellect. So the body perceives objects. So that's the sensory organs that do that. The mind feels emotions, and the intellect thinks thoughts. So from that perspective of the psychology, they would probably talk about this being the mind, really, the memory and conditioning, and then the different qualities of the mind. But here we're talking about body as in the sense organs, mind as the part that feels, and the intellect as the part that thinks. Here is a lovely analogy. Think of the body and mind intellect as being similar to workshop and tools. The workshop is the material body and the power tools are the energetic body. So you can easily expand this analogy. It could be thought of as a music recording studio and instruments in which music's made. Or it could be thought of the artist's studio and paints, brushes and canvas. Or it could be thought of as a dirty mechanic's automotive shop and the automotive repair tools. Or even a lab and reagents and lab equipments to symbolically represent the material body, the housing, and the energetic subtle body, the instruments. But be careful not to overextend the analogy, just grasp the point and take it as it is intended. The brain is part of the material body. The inner instrument of mind functions through the brain. So the brain is the hardware, the mind is the data processing software. Whereas sentience and cognition comprise the conditioning or programming code that is constantly being rewritten and updated. Where the body is an outer instrument of action and sentience, the mind intellect is an inner instrument of emotion and cognition. Alternately, the body can be thought of as a vehicle or vessel and the mind intellect as the driver. The BMI organism is like a transceiver. The body receives stimulus via actions and sentience from the outer world inwards, stores and processes the resulting sense objects and thought forms via memory and ego, after which the mind intellect transmits its responses via conditioning outward into the world. It's the continual collector and reflector of the sum total of past experiences and ongoing experiencing, actively remembering or not. So fourfold, the mind is the inner instrument. 1, the mind feels emotions, questions, state of decision relies on memory for processing biodata. 2, the intellect aspect of the mind is reasoning, inference or logical thinking. Conscience reinforces a sense of identity. Memory, stored impressions in active, accessible or latent, inaccessible yet causal form. And identity, sense of self, personhood, I, me, mine, as experiencer, possessor and controller. So these collectively constitute the inner instrument that processes all incoming stimuli and also informs all responses. This is the case regardless of the state one is in, waking, dreaming or sleeping. So I won't go further into that, but you can see the diagram he uses.
To send that to us so we can have a read through it.
I can do that, yeah. There's a relationship there, yeah. So through our practice of working through the 8 limbs of yoga, we ultimately begin to unravel what the various aspects of who we are. And through discernment, we can discern what is real and what is not real. Or, if you don't like to use that word, what is permanent and what's impermanent. And then ultimately, when we start to the immediate benefit, of course, is to be able to have an easier flow with our life. Because if we start to feel any stress or any anxiety, any of the negative stuff that usually causes our suffering, our dukkha, when we have that discernment to understand that, hey, that's impermanent, that's not the permanent aspect of who I am. That's just passing experience. Then we learn to let go of things a lot easier, a lot quicker. When we don't have that discernment, then we tend to cling on. We tend to get caught up in the stories, caught up in the suffering, caught up in the poor me and my life attitude, which most people are in to some degree or another. Poor me and my life. If only this or only that. But when we start to recognize that these are all just reactions and aspects of our own minds, yeah, we can have unpleasant experiences for sure. But the experience itself passes. I mean, an experience can be a traumatic experience, of course. But even the traumatic experiences pass. So ultimately it becomes our opportunity for liberation. Liberation of the cage that the mind is to most of us. As wonderful a tool as it can be, it also becomes our greatest cage for suffering. So understanding, learning about how the mind operates and recognizing its different qualities, the way it functions, and ultimately its impermanence, that becomes our greatest liberation. Whether it's just to be able to flow through our life with a lot more ease, or maybe ultimately to really dive in and understand and recognize and realize the deeper aspect of who we are, self-realization. So I think that should do for today, for